Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behaviour nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behaviour geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behaviour nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. You'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behaviour geeks. But we will start today's episode where I am super excited to welcome a previous ATA podcast guest, Nicolette Canzoneri, back to the show. You can hear our previous episode as number 115 of this show, which was released at the end of March 2020 in an episode called Applying the Laws of Behaviour Science to Help Save the World. But if you haven't listened to it, no worries. This episode is set to be equally as marvellous. So let's dive in. Nicolette Canzoneri has a Master's of Science in Environmental Sciences, focusing on free choice learning and behaviour change. Her thesis, Theory of Action for Pro-Environmental Behaviour Change at Zoos and Aquariums, uncovered gaps in program design and implementation where zoos targeted conservation-focused behaviour change in their human zoo visitors. These gaps, Nicolette discovered, were common for many AZA-accredited institutions and served as the basis for creating her new venture, EnvARK. Nicolette also holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, with a certificate in applied behaviour analysis, as well as an Associate of Science in Exotic Animal Training and Management, Animal Behaviour and Wildlife Education. Her expertise includes behaviour science, social science, research, informal learning, science communication, and behaviour-focused program design. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Nicolette back to the show today. Nicolette, thank you for taking the time to come and hang out with us again at Animal Training Academy.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here too.
And I remember the end of March 2020, I think I remember saying to you that that was the first episode where we talked about the pandemic on the ATA podcast. Like it was literally the start of everything. Hey, in your bio there, I said you discovered gaps in programs that were common for many AZA-accredited institutions. So I just wanted to start by asking you to, for the listeners of the show, explain what I mean when I say AZA-accredited institution.
Yeah, so I like that you say Z. We say AZA.
AZA.
Yeah, Association of Zoos and Aquariums is what AZA stands for. And that is sort of the large governing body based in the United States. Although I think, if I remember correctly, it also covers some international zoos and aquariums as well. And they essentially just set the standard for care for animals and what zoos and aquariums should be achieving. And so they have an accreditation standard in order to be a member institution. It's kind of the, gold standard, I would say.
Right. So significant because your thesis studied behaviour change focused at the zoo visitor that is being implemented in organisations accredited by AZA. Which is significant because they're setting the standards and your thesis discovered gaps in programs where there is room for improvement.
Yes. So one of the accreditation standards for AZA is that they have to have environmental education programming. And part of the environmental education programming, they require some nod towards conservation action or encouraging people to take action for wildlife. And what I thought was really interesting about that is that means it needs very specific behavioral sciences, social sciences, behavioral sciences to target behavior change. And so I was really curious about how that was being handled within accredited zoos and aquariums. And what I found in that was that they really aren't utilizing specifically behavioral science in the design and implementation of those programs. So that's the thesis in a nutshell.
You're right. And I didn't know what you just shared. And so I'm assuming the listeners of the show didn't know as well. What you just shared is that it's part of the guidelines or part of and you can tell me the correct word here, the requirements, the golden standard, that zoos are implementing conservation messaging that has an element of behavior change for zoo visitors. It's giving them some information, some ideas, some things that they can change in their day-to-day life or week to week or month to month or year to year, whatever it is. Is that correct? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, and I don't remember the exact language either in the requirement, but essentially it's under the conservation education or environmental education requirement. And I think it was like a bullet point, if I remember correctly, when I was reading through it, that said, they want to encourage people to action, right? Like that there should be some sort of messaging towards actions they can take. And I guess what's interesting about that is I feel like typically that is how conservation action or behavior change is referred to. It's kind of like, oh, just do this. Oh, just encourage action, just encourage behavior change. But as behavioral scientists know, it's not quite that simple, right? We can't just simply say, hey, by the way, do this thing, and then people do it. If it were that easy, we would live in a much different world, I think. So it's a little unfortunate. And I guess it was that mix of messaging where it's like, hey, this is something that's really important and we're going to require it as part of an accreditation standard, but we're not going to talk about how that gets done, even though it's pretty complex and requires expertise.
Right. So the writers of the bullet point were considering that behavior nerds would read it and say, what does that look like?
Right. Yes.
So in 2023, we are recording this in 2023. Zoos are so different, I feel, from when I first started working in the industry in the early 2000s. And the focus on animal training is now fantastic. The information available to keepers is just phenomenal. Also, though, the focus on conservation. Good zoos are no longer just collections of animals for people to come and see. They are conservation powerhouses. And the opportunities for zoos to connect with visitors and share conservation messages at a time when people are amazed and wowed and just open to receiving new information is really exciting. But when we are communicating with our visitors, often messaging is asking people, as we've just talked about, to, once they leave the zoo, change their behavior. Recycle more, consume less, do this, do that. And as you mentioned, as we know as animal trainers, behavior change isn't always so easy as simply telling people to do things. And there's one person or group of people in these organizations who has a really hard job, and I'm a bit curious about these people. They are the zoo directors, the decision makers, the people who need to know all the stuff about behavior change or hire the people that know all the stuff so that good programs can be developed. And I want to talk about these people today. Nicolette, you found, as we mentioned in your thesis, that there were gaps in these behavior change programs being implemented across zoos. So question, in these programs, how important is it or not, and how hard is it for the decision makers in zoos, or for the listeners of this podcast, any organization for that matter, the directors in these zoos, to stay connected to everything that's happening? Because if we are to change programs in zoos to get improved behavior change from zoo visitors, I assume it's pretty essential to have support from that level.
Yes. I mean, it's definitely a little difficult for, I would say, the directors, the decision makers. I'd also include in there funders and granting organizations too, because they typically have the requirements for a program, right? If they're going to fund a specific program, they'll say, like, this is what we're looking for as part of the funding. And so they play a big role in this. And what I would say is that oftentimes they don't have the capacity that they need to fulfill something like tackling a behavior change, a true behavior change campaign or initiative or program. And I would say that that's largely because that's not how things have been done historically. As you mentioned, they've changed a lot over the years, even since when we started, which wasn't that long ago, although I guess maybe 20 years is a long time now. The focus was typically on education and awareness raising, which are all important and crucial elements to moving the needle on conservation and environmental literacy. And zoos and aquariums play a really important role in doing those things. But if we are evolving as an industry and wanting to take things a step further, that evolution has growing pains. And I think one of those is that there's a lack of capacity and internal capacity to have experts, social scientists, behavioral scientists on staff to be able to produce the type of programming that is really necessary moving forward.
I like that wording, evolution has growing pains. And I think 20 years is a long time. I'm thinking back to when I was getting started, I had a bookshelf in a old shed at our bird training facility, and we had Ken Ramirez's textbook on there, and that's I just read it from start to finish, and my curator at the time manually printed some scientific papers or Natural Encounters Incorporated papers for me to read. You know, I couldn't go to the computer and access them myself. I had to read her printed versions.
Right. So, yep, same.
So that's just animal training and conservation and access to all of that information and podcasts and getting the AZA information about guidelines and stuff and accessing that so easily on your mobile phones. I mean, a lot has changed. But to make the kind of changes that are required that we're going to talk about in this episode, it's not just as simple as us making this podcast episode and all zoo directors listening to it and then we're good to go. Because as you mentioned, capacity is an issue. How hard do you think, talking directly to the zoo directors here or people in organizations that manage an entire organization, because this has crossover, I think, to lots of different workplaces, and also speak to employees who are listening to this because they are the ones who have to get that consent and that capacity from their managers. How hard is a zoo director's job? What are the obstacles in their way to implementing a new behavior change focused program for their zoo visitors?
Well, it's a very difficult job, right? I think there's a lot to be balancing in that role. I think the funding piece is really interesting, and that's kind of why I mentioned it too a minute ago. Is that, you know, if we have funders or granting organizations that are on board with this, I think it makes a director's job a little bit easier because they say, hey, okay, in order for us to even get this funding, to get the money that we need to do this program, we have to incorporate social and behavioral science. So I think that's a hurdle, is trying to get funders, granting organizations on board with this change. I am seeing that more and more because there is this realization generally that what we've been doing hasn't really worked that well. In some ways it has, but in a lot of ways it hasn't. And I think that we're all pretty aware of the fact that biodiversity loss is still a very, very big issue, and it's not going away. So I think as that changes, that will become easier, but that's certainly a challenge. I think also, I don't know how much of this is true or just a perception, but making sure that the staff is on board or has the ability to perform the work, because it is more work, right? Like there is more work to be done here. It's not something that can just happen by thinking about it. We have to do it. And so ensuring that there is the time and the resources within their own staff, I think is certainly one of the other challenges as well. And then kind of along those same lines is, do they have the expertise on staff? Or is that something that needs to come from outside of their organization to fill that gap? Because again, this is a change. And so people on staff that have the expertise in going into communities and implementing behavior change campaigns in communities, either that's a local community or a community where a species is endangered, it's not as common as hopefully it will become.
And zoo directors are humans, right? So
They are.
It must be frustrating, and I can imagine even for some people maybe frustrating first to have those obstacles, to have a lack of money, have a lack of fundraisers, have a lack of staff, have a lack of skill sets in their staff, ancestral resources to acquire them. But also it must be embarrassing sometimes to acknowledge that you've been doing things, air quotes, wrong. How has your experience been dealing with the very human side of trying to make changes in big organizations like zoos?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's exactly the feeling as a director or someone who has decision-making abilities, is that the mission a lot of times of these organizations is to conserve wildlife or protect them in some capacity. And then to be putting effort into that and trying to conserve animals, and then finding out that all those efforts have not led to the conservation that is needed. And in some cases, just like not only did it not conserve it, but like potentially has wreaked havoc on the communities in which they're serving, which is a little scary. But I think that it's embarrassing, and it's frustrating, it's disconcerting, because, that's what we're trying to do and we're not doing it.
Yeah. And you said this is a big issue and it's not going away. And for me, it's a big philosophical problem as well that we're discussing here, because obviously we don't want animals to go extinct in the wild. It's so wrong what's happening globally with so many species. And we can help improve our chances of progressing in a desirable direction if we address possible gaps in workplace programs like the ones we're talking about. But people need to understand behavior change if they want to get behavior change. At the same time, we totally understand the stress. Change is hard, and the change in access to resources is hard. We all experienced COVID and how that required innovation and flexibility from everyone. So we're actually in a pretty interesting place right now, I think, with regards to coming out of the other side of that. The good news is that we have EnvARK to the rescue. Nicolette, your new initiative that you've started since last we spoke in 2020, can you tell our listeners what EnvARK is, what you do, and how our listeners can work with you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it really stemmed from this idea that it doesn't really feel right to me to say that we are protecting wildlife, that it's our mission to protect wildlife. But then we kind of stop short when protecting them takes real work, right? And as you mentioned, the changes over the course of the last 20 years or more, but then even specifically over the last few with COVID, there has just been a lot of difficulty. I think that we were on track to start making some of these changes. COVID changed the landscape of many zoos and aquariums. At least for the last couple of years, people are trying to rebound now. And so I do think it is a good opportunity, a good time to start considering like, okay, so then how do we put our money where our mouth is? And instead of saying that we're going to protect species, we're conservation organizations first and foremost, but we're not interested in doing the work, change that narrative and say, okay, we're going to do it. And I would like to believe that that's where EnvARK comes in. As a result of that lack of capacity, as I have identified, what we strive to do is to come in and provide that capacity for zoos and aquariums, provide the expertise, provide the guidance that's needed to utilize social sciences effectively, and to incorporate behavioral sciences the way that it needs to be incorporated.
And if you're listening to this show and you want to, and you are a zoo director, or you're thinking about your zoo director, and you think that your organization could benefit from this added capacity, what's the process to, after you listen to this episode, take action?
Yes. And I appreciated that at the beginning you mentioned that the podcast and all these other things might not change behavior, because that's a big thing that I think about, right, is how often I'm educating others about what we're doing. And as we know, that doesn't actually lead to behavior change oftentimes. So in this case, the simple steps are to contact me, to contact EnvARK, and to set up a consultation. We can discuss what the needs are of the organization, what you're trying to accomplish, and how we can provide that capacity. And I think it's important to do that consultation because each organization is different, right? So the resources that are available change. And so we can work with what is available and leverage what you already have to amplify the program itself. So that's kind of first step is to contact us. And then we do that conversation, talk about what's available, do the assessment, and then we can create a path forward. We create a path forward.
And ultimately help preserve, protect species in the wild. Preserve and protect species in the wild.
Yeah.
Is that consultation, how does that work? Is that a free consultation? Is it something people have to book in and pay for? How does that work? Yeah,
it's totally free. Yeah, on our website, there's an opportunity to click on, I think, the contact page. I haven't looked at it in a while. We do need to update some of that stuff, but there's a contact there. And if you just click on that, it sends an email to me directly and we can go from there. It's pretty simple.
What's your website? It's
www.EnvARK, ENV as in Victor, ARK.org.
Awesome. So if you're listening to this and you acknowledge the space in your organization to explore improving your behavior change for zoo visitors program, book a consult with Nicolette. She's going to engage with you and provide an assessment, check out your capacity, improve your conservation program so that you can enjoy your organization leading the way in the zoo industry and helping to preserve and protect species in the wild. Can you give an example for the listeners of this show, a real life success story of someone who's done that and the outcome they achieved?
Yeah, I actually have a great example of something that we're working through right now that's really exciting. So I have been working with AZA a lot actually over the past couple of years. I'm involved in a few different projects. I'm on the Social Science Research and Evaluation Scientific Advisory Group as a steering committee member. I'm also helping the Animal Population Management Committee roll out some new requirements for population management among AZA institutions. And most notably, I am working on a Safe Pact pilot, which the SAFE stands for Saving Animals from Extinction, and PACT stands for People Advancing Conservation Together. AZA really likes their acronyms. It's not my fault. And so SAFEs have been around for a long time, and what they do is they just focus on threatened or endangered species, and experts on their ecology, biology come together and come up with a plan for conservation. The PACT part of that is the new initiative that is intending to bring social scientists to the table to improve program outcomes, all related to what we were just talking about, essentially that conservation we recognize now is not just about the ecology or the biology aspects of a species. Of course, that's important, and it's really important to know those things. But the major drivers of population declines are human caused, and so we can't ignore the human side of it. And so that's sort of the intent behind the PACT piece of Safe Pact. And so I got involved with that. I was referred to AZA as a social scientist through the scientific advisory group that I am a part of. And so we talked about what the group needs were, what we were trying to accomplish, what they were looking to do for the pilot, and we created a path forward from there. And I want to share a little bit about what we're actually doing in that pilot because it's really exciting. So I'm working with 5 different zoos and 2 safe species, which are the Asian hornbills and orangutans. And we are creating a program that addresses a common driver of population decline for both of those species. And I find this one particularly exciting. It's for a lot of reasons. But one of the main reasons is because we're getting sort of like this quadruple bang for our buck through this collaboration. We are targeting sustainably sourced wood tool procurement. So that addresses deforestation issues in home ranges for both species. It better supports zoos and aquariums missions to walk the talk of conservation internally, because we're addressing procurement within AZA facilities, and particularly the 5 that I'm working with. It also provides behavioral momentum for related behaviors. So we're starting with something that we can target specifically, and we want to use that then to launch additional behaviors. So what other sort of conservation related procurement behaviors can we encourage down the line? And last but not least, we're also developing out a toolkit that can be used by any zoo and aquarium that's interested in improving conservation outreach and procurement internally. So, within this collaboration, following this model, utilizing social sciences and behavioral sciences, and really being community driven and community based, we've been able to really, really amplify the impact that we're having through essentially one program. So again, it's taken a lot of work. It's different. It's a different process than people are used to. But through this process, we've made, this really great opportunity for these five different zoos to collaborate amongst one another, and collaborate across 2 different endangered species. So it's really exciting.
So did I hear correctly that the behavior change is procuring new wood tools?
Yes,
sustainable wood tools. All right. So what was the old behavior before?
So there wasn't one, right? So what we evaluated as part of this process, so because it's behavior-based, we started with behavior selection, and we did a ton of research as to what were the overlapping drivers of population decline for both of the species, and one of those was deforestation. And so we looked at what contributes to deforestation, and I will tell you, this is very complicated, right? As I'm sure you can imagine, what contributes to deforestation is a very long list of things, and again, all human drivers, right? And what we've settled on were a handful of things that we felt were something that we could target. We had also selected our audience being staff at zoos and aquariums, because it's a little bit more of a known quantity. It's easier for us to work with them, at least getting started. And it was really important for me that we had some early success, because as animal trainers know, we want to set people up for success. And so that was important to me. So we selected the zoo staff. We had a handful of behaviors that seemed approachable, reasonable, feasible. And we actually did a penetration survey to determine which of those behaviors we should target. So again, this is where social sciences and behavioral sciences come into play. So instead of just making a decision by ourselves in a room without talking to our audience, we said, well, let's find out what people are already doing. There's no reason to create an entire campaign or a program around a behavior that's already being done. So instead of wasting resources that way, we went out and said, hey, it was very sophisticated, but the boiled down version is, hey, what are you guys already doing that's related to these things? So we looked at paper bag use at grocery stores. We looked at paper bag use at zoo ground, like on zoo grounds. So like, are people bringing reusable bags when they're bringing their lunch? Are they bringing reusable bags when they're bringing other items to the zoo? Are they using paper bags for husbandry practices? So, inside habitats for enrichment? Are you using them for bedding? Those types of things, just to see, what was happening. Are they already recycled content? Do they have recycled content, and are they recycled bags? Those types of things. And one of the other behaviors was wood tools. So ramen dowels are often used in wood tools, and ramen comes from very specific types of trees that are important habitats for both hornbills and orangutans. And so that was something that we had identified as a potential driver of deforestation. And what we found out was that a lot of those other things were kind of already being done. There really wasn't a lot of room to move the needle. People were pretty good about using recycled. If they were using paper bags at all, recycled paper paper bags. But what was really interesting about the survey was that there was almost no one said that they were using sustainably sourced wood tools that potentially have ramen dowels in them. But there was a ton of interest in how to do that. So that was one of the other things that we asked about, was essentially like, how interested are you in doing this behavior, right? We want to gauge people's motivation as well. And so we said, all right, we've found our behavior. And so that's how we targeted that.
Right. And is the idea then to get that message out to the users of wooden tools in the zoo visitor population?
Well, so right now we're starting with just sustainably sourced wood tool practices within zoos and aquariums. So what we're focusing on is, how do people in charge of procurement, so in charge of purchasing wood tools, how do we get them to buy sustainably sourced wood tools? And so that's the focus, is to get them to do that. So we did some audience research on barriers and benefits to doing that. And now we are in the strategy design phase, where we will be coming up with tools that we will employ and implement at the 5 different zoos to increase the adoption of that behavior.
And how do you do that?
How do we do the strategy development?
How do you encourage the procurement personnel to do the new behavior of sourcing the sustainable tool product?
Great question. So we rely heavily on our audience research. So that barrier and benefit data that we collected essentially points us to what the barriers are, right? So instead of, again, making assumptions and creating tools or resources that aren't needed by the audience, we asked them. We said, hey, how do we help you do this, right? And so we have analyzed that data, and we're, I guess, within social sciences, and specifically the community-based social marketing process that I utilize. Each type of barrier points directly to a social science tool, and so that's what we're looking at now. So we've uncovered that there is a lack of understanding of how to procure them. So we want, in this case, education actually is an important piece, but we're also, as we do that, are going to develop out sort of like guidelines around what's considered sustainably sourced, and where they can actually buy them, and if there's any opportunities for them to switch providers, we would provide that information, and then we'll also increase motivation by highlighting the benefits that they reported to us. So not necessarily our benefits, although they're related because we're all in the same industry. But in this case, specifically what these procurement people said were important to them. So we will highlight that as well.
And then what do they say is important to them? I'm assuming cost.
So no, actually, that was really interesting. So that was one of the questions we asked, because we were concerned that potentially that could be a barrier. And we found that that's actually not one of the barriers, which is why you do audience research, right? So if we had tried to put together a program that intended to reduce the cost, and that was it might not have worked, because the reality is that it seems to me that they're willing to spend an additional amount of money if they know that they're sustainably sourced wood tools. Again, because this goes back to the mission of Zoos and Aquariums, which is that we're conservation organizations. It's really difficult for us to say that other people should be taking conservation action if we're not taking that same conservation action. And so I think we realize that there's a lot of value in walking the talk. And so the good news is, it seems like cost is not a prohibiting factor. Instead, they want to showcase that they are walking the talk, that they are actually being advocates of conservation within their role at the zoo that they're working for, which is great. They also want to protect species. They want to protect the environment, right? So there's a lot of overlapping reasons why the procurement people want to get on board with sustainably sourced wood tools.
Yeah, that's a great story to tell zoo visitors.
Yes, that too.
And I think about my purchasing of wooden tools. I think when I'm purchasing anything, I'm looking. We have a label in Australasia called FSC. I don't know if you have that same one in North America. Do you do?
We do.
Yeah, cool. And I learned that from my time at Wellington Zoo. So there you go. Now that's awesome. For these 5 zoos who have access to you, and these resources, but but as we know, there's more than 5 zoos in the world. So there's people listening to this who are in that space of having limited capacity, not being able to contact EnvARK, not having the skills to know that they need to talk to their staff and talk to their procurement people and figure out the actual behaviors that they need to try and change. Have you been involved in a story or a program that's failed because of capacity?
Yes. Well, so first of all, I see this a lot. If there's a lot of very well-intentioned programs out there that intend to change behavior, I know of one particularly that I wasn't involved with directly, but was shared on a panel that I coordinated and hosted at one of the AZA conferences a couple years ago with Woodland Park Zoo. And what's interesting about that is they had attempted to sort of utilize social sciences, behavioral sciences. But again, because of the lack of expertise and capacity, when they were looking at wildlife trafficking on zoo grounds, messaging around that. And ultimately what they found out as a result of their efforts was that they completely missed the mark because they hadn't done the audience research that they should have done it up front. And what they learned from that is to partner with social science experts. And actually, I had an opportunity to work with them after that on a really exciting program that we launched. Well, we're at the design phases of in March of 2020. It was on domestic wildlife trafficking with cruise ship passengers to Alaska. And unfortunately, we had just started the strategy design phase in February of 2020. And I think needless to say, we all know what happened in March of 2020, and targeting cruise travelers was a completely obsolete program due to no fault of our own. But what was cool about working with them is seeing the differences, right? So that one failed. I guess it really wasn't a failure technically. It was a unfinished project, but not a failure of social sciences, but because of a global pandemic. And so I think that's a good example of ways that social science can come to the rescue.
How did they originally miss the mark? What was their original mark?
Well, so they wanted to use social norms to influence wildlife trafficking, to reduce wildlife trafficking. But what they found is that people didn't realize that was a problem domestically, right? So we talk about wildlife trafficking typically in international places, and it becomes difficult for people to relate to things international, right? Like rhino horn isn't necessarily something that most people are even in a situation where they could purchase that, right? Like that's not a very common behavior. And so it was really like a look at, well, what are we encouraging? Are there local wildlife trafficking issues that we can encourage instead? And then there was kind of a lack of even understanding around that too. So it kind of became a non-starter.
Yeah, I imagine there's many similar projects around the world. For example, me just making an assumption that cost is an important thing, X individual in zoos. I want to hear more success though. Do you have more stories of success that you can share with the listeners of the show of how they've got in touch with you or you've worked with them, you've figured out your way through those capacity issues, done some research and come up with programs that have helped impact species on the ground?
Yeah. Well, I think to go back to that same example with Woodland Park Zoo, I think that their program that was targeting the cruise ship passengers was a success up until the point we had to stop. So what we did for that, which was really exciting, and it was the same sort of story, which is, by the way, we all have assumptions, so it's okay, Ryan. I would have assumed the same thing. And, to be fair, a lot of what goes into some of our audience research is some assumptions that we have, but we're testing those assumptions, right? Instead of relying on them. And in addition to other research. But in this case, with the cruise ship passengers, there was a lot of assumptions about who the people were, who that audience was to begin with, and what the barriers were to reducing wildlife trafficking, and what the benefits were to reducing wildlife trafficking for that particular audience. And what was really great, I would say this is a success within a success, was that we had some skeptical people in that group when we started, because they thought, well, why do we need to go through this process? Why do we need to ask people? Why do we need to do these audience research pieces? And why do we have to do a behavior selection? And right, like all of this, the social science piece of it, like, why do we have to do that? It takes too long. It's too hard. Why don't we just go and do something already? And I love those people because I get to show them why it's important to do that. And so even within our unfortunately unrealized campaign in the end, what we did learn was that we were very off in terms of benefits and barriers. We had some of the people on our team, on the Woodland Park Zoo team, that actually went on a cruise to find out, because most of us had never even been on a cruise, right? And so they went on to see, like, well, what does a cruise to Alaska look like? What are people doing? Who are these people, right? Like, where are they coming from? What's important to them? How do they like to enjoy the cruise? Why are they even on a cruise to Alaska to begin with? And that was really eye-opening, just from a process standpoint, even like, how do you get on a cruise ship? How do you get off a cruise ship? What happens, during the days while you're at sea, and what happens when you're at port? And so they found out some really crucial information on what was happening there. And then beyond that, we did some audience research with cruise ship passengers who were returning and or departing from Seattle. This was at the end of 2019, and we surveyed them and asked them a bunch of questions about essentially the same thing. What's your intentions for being here? Did you buy these things? So we listed off a bunch of things that they could have purchased in Alaska that were both non-wildlife trafficking related, so non-wildlife products, and things that were wildlife products, because a lot of times people don't even think about it, right? They're purchasing something at a gift store in Alaska to remind them of the trip that they were on, seeing the beautiful nature, seeing the animal potentially. It could be like whale bones. And what we discovered through that process is that there was actually enough people who were purchasing animal products that it was worth even addressing, because they weren't even sure if that was happening. And so that was a success. We also learned that the people who purchased those items were very interested in making sure that they were sustainable, making sure that they weren't doing anything illegal, that it wasn't their intention to be buying things that were hurting the animals or hurting the environment, that they were doing it for different reasons. And we also found out sort of like reasons why they might not know, or they might not be able to find out if it was sustainably sourced, right? So there are with indigenous communities, they are allowed to collect some of like marine mammal parts, bones, teeth, those types of things that are otherwise prohibited. And so there was also an interest in making sure that we weren't hurting indigenous communities in that way, right? So there was like a lot of benefits that came out of what the research that we did, even though we couldn't push it past, into an actual implementation phase due to COVID. We learned a ton about what was going on with wildlife trafficking between Alaska and Seattle, and essentially the rest of the United States. So I think that was a success overall.
So the behavior change would have been related to sustainable purchasing behavior in cruise ship travelers?
Yes. Yeah. So what we were developing out was a sort of toolkit for people to feel confident in their purchases. So it was going to be around questions to ask the shop owners or whoever they were purchasing it from. There were specific things they could look for that would indicate whether or not it was an animal product to begin with, and then also if it had come from a legal source.
And I never had the bonus of going on a cruise as a zoo employee, so I'm quite jealous about that. And I like your unintentional pun there. They found out some crucial information. Do you super keen to hear, looking at the time, but if you have more success stories, super keen to hear them.
Yeah, I mean, I think just briefly I can list off a couple. So Houston Zoo has done a lot of work in this arena, specifically around community-based social marketing and utilizing behavior change principles with their zoo staff. So they've really pushed towards this conservation culture within the zoo. One of the examples of that is their plastic-free July, which has been very successful. I didn't have a direct, I guess, impact on that specifically, but I've worked with them in other ways, presenting on that information. And they also had a sea lion. Well, so the sea lion team there, I had a good friend that was working as one of the leads there, and they had they led an entanglement with the monofilament fishing line program that was wildly successful on the jetty that was in Houston, and they were able to reduce essentially it was the trash, right, of fishermen that were not recycling or properly disposing of their monofilament lines. And they used social and behavioral sciences in that program, and it was very successful. Another interesting one was with the Akron Zoo. So they did something very different. They were looking at changing the language of their zoo staff. They wanted to replace non-empathy building words and phrases with empathy building words and phrases in an effort to better communicate the zoo mission. So one of the impetus behind that was, that detractors are really good at communicating why zoos and aquariums shouldn't exist, and they wanted to be better at communicating the benefits and the successful pieces of being a zoo or an aquarium. And so that was successful. They utilized behavior change principles around language. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at how behavioral science can be utilized.
Wonderful. And if you, the listener of the show, want to learn more about this thing that Nicolette has been talking about today, community-based social marketing, you can go back and listen to episode 115 of the show. We talked about it a lot on our first episode. And I think the title of that first episode, I'm not going to do it, but it could also be the title of this episode, Applying the Laws of Behavior Science to Help Save the World. Last question, Nicolette, before we wrap up today. I'm curious for you to define the transformation that organizations and decision makers in zoos will have if they work for you. What is the identity that you're helping zoos create? What does a world-leading conservation-based zoo look like in 2023?
Great question. If zoos and aquariums partner with EnvARK, they will be able to realize their goals of conserving wildlife and becoming leaders in the conservation field. They'll be able to provide value to the communities in which they serve, both locally and globally. And, by using social sciences effectively, they'll really be able to address the root cause of biodiversity loss, which is humans, but without losing sight of the importance people play in achieving conservation. And I think that those are really important. Those are really important now as we've evolved to understand that the communities that we're serving are really important pieces to conservation generally. And it's not something that we want to push on them, but we want to create with them.
And the root cause is humans. And can we go more meta and say human behavior? Therefore,
human behavior.
Into the behavior nerds.
Yeah, it's human behavior. And in order to address human behavior, you have to use behavioral science. There's no way around it.
Love it. Hey, thanks so much for sharing everything today, Nicolette. Just before we do officially wrap up, though, I know we mentioned this towards the start of the episode, but could you please just remind everyone listening where they can go to find out more about EnvARK, more about you, and get in touch?
Yeah, check out our website, www.envark.org. EnvARK, ENV as in Victor, ARK.org, and contact me there. I'd love to have a conversation. I think that's really where things start, is for me to understand what the needs are and how I can best assist. And that's ultimately our goal, is we want to help zoos and aquariums achieve their missions.
Fantastic. And we will, of course, link to EnvARK in the show notes as well. This has been so much fun from myself and on behalf of everyone listening. Nicolette, we really appreciate you taking the time to come back on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm excited to see where this takes us.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behaviour geeks. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.